At daybreak, federal agents raided a dim sum restaurant in Missouri.
Federal agents raided Golden Apple Buffet here in St. Peter's off Mexico Road Tuesday. Federal agents had also stormed two suburban homes where neighbors reported about 20 people living inside.
Before long, it escalated into a nationwide ICE sweep on Chinese communities, uncovering visa scams and hidden drug caches.
Where are you from?
India.
India.
China.
China.
Yeah.
China.
Yolian Ye, along with the indictment of another 56-year-old named Dae Jin Ye. Both face up to 10 years in prison and fines up to $250,000.
What ICE found inside those kitchens went far beyond undocumented workers. We're talking forged passports, bricks of narcotics hidden in soy sauce shipments, and a smuggling pipeline that ran from Houston all the way back to Beijing. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at Operation Silent Dragon and why Chinese restaurants ended up on the front line of Trump's biggest immigration crackdown. The first clips that spread across social media in the spring of 2025 were shocking. In one video, a Chinese man was restrained in the middle of a Chinatown street in California by two women in plain clothes, while onlookers stared in disbelief. Just seconds later, 4 masked men rushed in, dragged him into a black car, and drove away. The images left the Chinese community stunned, caught between fear and anger. But that was only the beginning. On the same day, dozens of workers at another Chinatown market were handcuffed, lined up, and shoved into vans. At that point, nobody believed this was just an isolated incident. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, better known as ICE, along with the Department of Homeland Security, confirmed it was part of a nationwide campaign to crack down on undocumented immigrants, especially those using fake papers or overstaying visas. Yet, once the official explanation came out, the controversy only grew louder. If this was only about illegal immigration, then why was ICE working so closely with the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Department of Justice? At press briefings, American officials insisted the campaign wasn't just about deportations, but about dismantling organized crime networks where Chinese groups overlapped with Mexican drug cartels. According to ICE, many restaurants, bars, karaoke lounges, and massage parlors in major U.S. cities were nothing more than fronts. Behind them ran a whole underground ecosystem: drug trafficking, forged documents, human smuggling and forced labor, and money laundering through underground banks tied back to mainland China. What began as a story about illegal immigration was now morphing into something far more complicated and dangerous. The raids that made headlines quickly painted a grim picture. In Missouri, a buffet restaurant called Golden Apple Buffet became the center of attention when joint forces stormed in. Dozens of Chinese workers were arrested. Many lived crammed into houses registered under an LLC, showing there was an organized network behind the scenes. The fake documents they seized were sophisticated enough to pass through the DMV for driver's licenses and even slip past commercial banks unnoticed. But this wasn't just a Missouri problem. Reports showed raids spreading nationwide, from California and Los Angeles to New York. Nightclubs, karaoke bars, and even brothels were exposed, showing tight connections with Mexican drug cartels. Americans started asking, just how many of these hidden cells have been operating without anyone noticing? Statistics from the first half of 2025 were staggering. In just 6 months, 103 Chinese nationals were arrested under the campaign. During a 3-week peak period, arrests of undocumented Chinese immigrants spiked tenfold compared with the same time the previous year. Authorities also revealed the massive scale of the money laundering. Chinese-run underground banks in the U.S. were processing hundreds of millions of dollars each month, charging fees of 2 to 4%. A small buffet in Missouri could serve as a transfer station to launder money for a nightclub in Los Angeles, or even a construction site in New York. The spread of this network showed it wasn't a few individuals acting alone, but a system spanning states and even nations. As investigators tore apart kitchens and storerooms, more shocking details emerged. Some places hid drugs right under the floor, disguised as barrels of soy sauce or boxes of spices. That shifted the story from illegal labor to drug trafficking. But the revelations went even further. Some seized files pointed to ties with Chinese intelligence networks. In Virginia, 2 Chinese nationals were indicted for smuggling radiation-hardened microchips, the kind used in satellites, military AI systems, and advanced weapons. In another case, Yunhai Li was accused of stealing U.S. medical data to funnel back to China. These cases turned ICE and DOJ's campaign into not just immigration enforcement, but also counter-espionage, a field that had already fueled years of U.S.-China tensions. The impact on the Chinese-American community was immediate and deep. In Los Angeles, revenues for Chinese restaurants and supermarkets reportedly dropped by as much as 50% in 2025. Many businesses had to shut down, either from losing workers to arrests or from customers too afraid to visit. A heavy atmosphere set in, a community already facing prejudice, now drowning in fear and mistrust. Chinese Americans began asking themselves, will we all be lumped together with criminals just because of where we come from? By summer 2025, the campaign entered a new stage: mass deportations. ICE started chartering planes to send groups of detainees back to China. In Dallas, 122 people were deported on a single flight, including serious offenders, murderers, drug traffickers, rapists, and bribers. To many Americans, this looked like justice being served. But to others, it resembled collective punishment, since plenty of people were deported over administrative errors or paperwork issues. Beijing reacted sharply, accusing Washington of racial discrimination and of branding an entire community as criminals. This diplomatic clash only deepened divisions, leaving Chinese Americans stuck in a painful limbo, distrusted by U.S. authorities, yet exploited as political pawns by China. Throughout the campaign, 2 opposing narratives ran side by side. U.S. officials insisted the evidence was undeniable. Many Chinese businesses really were covers for laundering, drugs, and even espionage. And America could not just sit idly by. On the other hand, immigrant and human rights groups pointed out that many arrested were just regular workers, some even with valid papers, yet swept up in the raids. For them, this campaign shattered families, spread fear, and turned an entire community into collective victims. The problem was that truth and falsehood were so tightly mixed, it was nearly impossible to draw a clear line. And while real criminals were exposed, thousands of innocent people were left to suffer heavy consequences. That's why the ICE 2025 campaign is seen as an unprecedented turning point in U.S. immigration enforcement. It didn't just stop at undocumented migrants, but escalated into breaking apart organized crime networks and even tracking links to Chinese espionage. A complex picture emerged: restaurants, nightclubs, karaoke bars, underground banks, Mexican cartels, and Chinese intelligence cells all tied together. But with that came deep cracks in American society. The Chinese community bore heavy losses, and U.S.-China relations grew even more tense and unpredictable. If you only look at the surface of the events, you'd see a campaign to crack down on crime. But put it in the historical context of U.S.-China relations and America's immigration story, and you start to see much deeper complexities. For decades, Chinatowns and Chinese immigrant communities have embodied a kind of ambiguity. They've helped shape America's multicultural identity, and at the same time, they've often been tied to stereotypes about underground crime, and secret societies. Back in the 19th century, there was a fierce anti-Chinese wave that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Even though that law was repealed long ago, the collective memory still lingers, and whenever big events touch Chinese communities, American public opinion tends to respond with a mix of suspicion, fear, and cultural friction. So the ICE 2025 campaign isn't just law enforcement. It reopens historical wounds that were never fully healed. The U.S. media have been deeply divided in how they cover the story. Big outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post have focused on the human rights angle, interviewing families torn apart by arrests or deportations. Those reports are full of heartbreaking scenes. A mother taken away while her child is still in elementary school. A father who only worked as a line cook and had no criminal record, but ends up on a deportation list because his paperwork was messy. By contrast, conservative channels like Fox News and many local papers have emphasized the crime angle. Hidden drug stashes under restaurants, money laundered through underground banks, and shadowy links to Mexican cartels. That media split mirrors the fault lines in American society itself, between people prioritizing national security and people calling for humane treatment. On the diplomatic stage, Beijing sees the ICE campaign as a double blow. On one hand, it weakens overseas Chinese networks that matter economically and socially to China. On the other hand, it's being framed as systematic discrimination that paints all Chinese people as criminals. China's foreign ministry has repeatedly protested, accusing Washington of using the law to suppress people of Chinese descent and harming bilateral relations. The U.S. response is that there's clear evidence of transnational crime networks and even links to Chinese intelligence. Both sides are stuck in a loop of accusation, rebuttal, and escalating tension. The result: U.S.-China relations, already strained by trade, technology, and Taiwan, now have another hotspot. Another angle is the domestic social impact. For many Americans, especially among working-class white and Latino communities, the ICE 2025 campaign was seen as a win for jobs and local safety. In states like Missouri, Texas, and Ohio, local opinion cheered when suspect restaurants were shut down. But for other immigrant communities, it was a warning. If today it's the Chinese community under the microscope, tomorrow it could be anyone else. That fear pushes immigrant groups inward, reduces civic participation, and widens cultural gaps with native-born communities. Some scholars call this the immigration domino effect. When one group is targeted, anxiety spreads to others, breeding quiet division and tension. A key point the campaign highlights is how globally connected modern crime has become. These aren't just local gangs operating in a small area. The China-Mexico-U.S. criminal networks, ICE, and the DEA targeted are described as a globalized, underground ecosystem. Money can transfer from a small buffet in Missouri to a nightclub in Los Angeles, then through an underground bank to Shenzhen, and come back as apparently legitimate investment. Drugs flow from Mexico into California and are distributed through legal-looking fronts like bars and karaoke lounges. Sophisticated technology chips are smuggled from the U.S. to China to serve defense industries. It's a tangled picture where cash, drugs, technology, and labor intersect, a direct challenge to traditional U.S. security models. Among academics and experts, the big question is whether the ICE 2025 campaign really works, or if it's only hitting the visible tip of a much bigger iceberg. Some argue that raiding small businesses is just surface level. The financial networks that launder money remain intact and can't be dismantled by raids alone. Mass deportations might solve an immediate problem, but they also create openings for other groups to move in or push criminal networks to become even more sophisticated. Supporters, though, believe that a strong, coordinated strike is the only way to create enough disruption to disorient these organizations and throw them off balance for a time. From the perspective of the Chinese community, the tragedy lies in the way truth and falsehood got mixed together. Some businesses really were involved in smuggling, money laundering, or espionage. But others were just people trying to make a living, doing kitchen work, or running small shops. Once the campaign began, the line between criminal and ordinary immigrant blurred in the eyes of the public. That turned into a kind of collective guilt imposed on the whole community, something history has shown many times during moments of racial tension. For countless Chinese families, the fear didn't only come from police or ICE, but also from the suspicious looks of neighbors, co-workers, and even friends. On the broader stage, the ICE 2025 campaign became a prime example of national security in the age of globalization. It showed how the boundaries between immigration, crime, and international espionage are getting less and less clear. A single person could be both an undocumented worker and part of a laundering network. A restaurant might serve normal customers while also hiding drugs. An engineer might hold a day job at a tech firm while secretly sending data back to China. In today's world, categories don't stay separate. They overlap and intertwine. That's exactly what makes governance harder than ever. In Washington, ICE 2025 quickly turned into a hot political issue. Congress split sharply. Republicans saw it as proof of their tough on immigration and crime stance, a powerful political card to reinforce the image of protecting law and order. Democrats, on the other hand, emphasized human rights, arguing that ICE's measures often went too far, turning law enforcement into an ethnic witch hunt. Some progressive lawmakers even called for an independent commission to investigate arrest and deportation procedures, and demanded more transparent numbers on how many deported people were actual criminals versus those who just had administrative violations. Inside the White House, national security advisors were said to play a big role in broadening the campaign, especially after evidence of chip smuggling and espionage came to light. Their argument was, if these front networks can hide drugs and launder money, they could just as easily cover up intelligence operations. When sensitive technology, like radiation-hardened chips, artificial intelligence, or medical data, is secretly sent to China, the issue goes beyond immigration and cuts straight into the core of national security. That's why, despite domestic opposition, the U.S. government chose an all-out approach, treating it as part of the broader strategy to contain China on every front. Immigration policy experts warned that this approach could create a wave of fear, not just in Chinese communities, but among immigrants overall. When trust in public institutions breaks down, people may avoid cooperating with police, or worse, some groups may turn to criminal organizations as a form of protection. In other words, while the campaign might achieve short-term success in arrests and deportations, in the long run it could weaken social cohesion and backfire against its own security goals. As one Harvard scholar put it, you can't defend a nation by sowing fear in the very communities you want to integrate. Security can't be separated from trust. From Beijing's side, the response went beyond diplomatic statements. Chinese state media ramped up coverage of the overseas Chinese victims, portraying the U.S. as a racist nation abusing laws to oppress minorities. Some TV programs even aired emotional footage of broken Chinese families in America, side by side with foreign ministry press conferences, to stir nationalist sentiment at home. Analysts argued that Beijing wanted to use the situation as a soft weapon, turning overseas Chinese into symbols in its propaganda battle with Washington. But that put Chinese diaspora communities in an impossible position, distrusted by America, while also being treated by China as political tools. Looking ahead, people are imagining different scenarios. The pessimistic one says the U.S. will keep expanding the campaign, maybe even rolling out biometric surveillance and big data tracking to monitor the Chinese community. That could lead to a kind of dark era, similar to the years after 9/11, when Muslims in America became targets of surveillance and discrimination. A more optimistic scenario is that after the peak of the crackdown, the U.S. government will be forced to adjust, shifting from mass raids to more precise targeting, focusing only on individuals and organizations truly tied to crime or espionage. If that happens, ICE 2025 could become the starting point for a new model of security immigration cooperation, one that balances national protection with human rights. In terms of U.S.-China relations, it's unlikely this issue will stop at diplomatic quarrels. It has opened up a new front, the human front. In the past, U.S.-China tensions were mostly about trade, technology, or the military. Now immigrant communities are pulled directly into the rivalry. That makes reconciliation harder, because this isn't just about governments or corporations anymore. It touches millions of ordinary lives. Observers warn that any future attempts at easing tensions will run into obstacles, because the campaign has already carved itself into the collective memory of both nations. From a cultural and social perspective, scholars say the ICE 2025 events will leave long-term scars in the Chinese community in America. Younger generations may grow up feeling insecure about their identity. They're American, but always looked at with suspicion. Many parents have already started telling their kids not to speak Chinese in public or to avoid Chinatown so they won't be labeled. That broken trust could last for decades, slowing down integration that was never easy to begin with. Still, within the tragedy, there are signs of hope. Civil society groups, immigrant rights advocates, and Chinese-American activists are using this moment to speak up more strongly. They're calling for transparency, providing legal aid to detainees, and building bridges with other communities to push back against prejudice. A new movement may be forming, one that demands fairness and refuses to equate an entire community with crime. If it grows, it could become an unexpected but positive legacy of ICE 2025. At its core, the campaign exposed a paradox. While aiming to safeguard security and order, it highlighted how fragile social trust really is. Chinese Americans, guilty or innocent, got swept into a storm of suspicion. Native-born Americans, whether supportive or critical, felt the growing polarization. And the U.S. and China, already locked in global rivalry, dragged migrant communities into their power struggle. In a globalized world, the boundaries between immigration, crime, and international politics are blurred. ICE 2025 isn't just a police operation. It's a mirror reflecting the tensions, contradictions, and tragedies of our time. To close the loop, we go back to where it all started. The viral clips on social media, one Chinese man dragged away in the street, workers handcuffed and loaded into vans. At first, those images shocked because of their drama. Later, they became symbols of a much bigger crisis, a crisis of immigration, of social trust, of national security, and of international relations. Viewers weren't just watching an arrest, they were seeing deep cracks in American society and in U.S.-China ties. One thing stands out in this story. Every boundary has been blurred. The line between undocumented and legal worker faded, since many detainees had valid papers. The line between ordinary restaurant and criminal hub grew murky when a buffet could serve food and launder money at the same time. The line between domestic security and international espionage was erased as drug raids uncovered smuggling networks for military-grade microchips. This blurring made the Chinese community double victims, harmed by criminals within, but also judged collectively by American society. At the national level, ICE 2025 reflects America's growing anxiety over China's rise. To U.S. security planners, every crime or espionage case wasn't just criminal, it was part of a strategic battlefield with Beijing. That led to harsher measures. Every immigration loophole could be a gateway for drugs, dirty money, or sensitive technology. The irony is, the tougher America acts, the more it risks damaging its own image, as a country that once prided itself on human rights, cultural diversity, and opportunity for immigrants. For the community, the psychological scars run deep. Chinese kids may grow up remembering parents or relatives being taken away, or the shuttering of familiar restaurants and shops. They'll learn to live in a world where their heritage is both a source of pride and a reason for suspicion. That fear might produce more reserved generations, hesitant to step forward, or, conversely, it could inspire new activists determined to fight for fairness. Either way, the weight of this moment will linger far beyond 2025, shaping decades to come. For Americans overall, the campaign sparks a bigger question. What kind of country do we want to be? A closed-off America that prioritizes absolute security, willing to sacrifice freedom and rights to guard its borders? Or an open America that accepts risk while staying true to its Enlightenment values? This isn't just about the Chinese, it's about all immigrant communities, which have long been the driving force of the American story. Today's choice will define how history sees this generation. On the global stage, ICE 2025 shows that clear boundaries no longer exist. Crime crosses borders, espionage hides within immigration, and diplomatic conflict can flare up from a single small restaurant in Missouri. It's a reminder that in a globalized world, no country can wall itself off from interconnected flows. The U.S. can deport thousands of people, but money, data, and technology will keep finding paths. China can condemn the U.S., but it can't deny responsibility for allowing underground networks to flourish. And caught in the middle are ordinary people, workers, shop owners, families, who bear the heaviest costs. Perhaps the most important lesson from ICE 2025 is the fragility of trust. Chinese Americans no longer fully trust the law to protect them. Native-born Americans no longer fully trust that these businesses are innocent. The U.S. government doesn't trust immigrants from a rival power to stay neutral. And the U.S. and China don't trust each other's intentions. Once trust breaks down, law and politics are just band-aids, not real healing. Seen through a human lens, this is a story of the struggle between security and rights, between protecting a nation and protecting its people. There's no denying that crime and espionage exist and must be stopped. But it's also undeniable that behind every arrest are real people, families, and unfinished immigrant dreams. Balancing these realities is the greatest challenge and the ultimate test of democracy. When history looks back, ICE 2025 may not only be remembered as a crime crackdown, but as a mirror of the fears, contradictions, and hopes of our era. It will remind us that in a globalized world, even something that begins with a buffet in Missouri or a viral clip in Chinatown can spiral into a global crisis. And above all, it will leave us with the question, can we, as an international community, find a way to confront crime and espionage without losing our humanity, our trust, and our shared dream of a world that is both safe and just?